Hey y'all, welcome back to Group Therapy. I'm one of your hosts, licensed psychologist, Dr. Jessica Rabon.
And I'm licensed psychologist, Dr. J.
And I'm licensed clinical social worker, Kristen Gingrich.
National Grief Awareness Day is this Wednesday, August 30th. So we're going to be talking all about grief. So settle in, take a seat, and welcome to Group Therapy. But before we dive into the heavy topic of grief, let's go back to our reflection question from last week, where we asked you if you could be friends with a celebrity, influencer, or fictional character, who would it be? Y'all, we got so many good responses, and a lot of you said us, so thank you all. But
wow,
I just wanted to highlight some of my favorites. Like, we got so many, so we have to just post some of them. First one. Ben and Jerry. I love their ice cream.
Are Ben and Jerry a real people?
They are. One of them passed a year or two ago, and I can't remember which one, but they are real.
Oh,
that ties into our grief episode.
It does.
Another answer I love was Mia Thermopolis. If you know, you know.
Solid
Justin
choice.
has no idea.
I'm like, can I buy a vowel? I have no idea.
The Princess Diaries?
But yeah, no.
I really liked this one. I'm stuck in 2008. My answer is Lil Wayne.
Okay. Yeah.
We did get a couple. Dr. J's mom.
She's pretty awesome.
Absolutely. I would second that.
Barb is a lot of fun.
Also got a lot of Taylor Swift's and Sophia Bush's. So I don't know if our episode primed y'all, since that's what we said, but yeah, so those were some great responses. But you all had some great answers. Influencers, celebrities, fictional characters. You know, it was great.
Justin, what's yours? What's your parasocial?
Ew, I know. I don't. I don't think I have one, like, off the top of my head. I should have came prepared. And
who would you want to be friends with then? If you don't have a parasocial relationship?
LeBron James. LeBron James is the same age as me. We grew up in the same place. He's also a father. I think he's just like a role model on and off the court. And he's actually an insane athlete, which is like the dead opposite of me.
But who can do yoga better?
Solid choice.
Listen, probably still him. Probably still.
And we'll have to ask K10 when she comes back who her parasocial is or who she would want to be friends with. But yeah. So as always, thank you all for participating. Thanks for your answers. But today we're talking all about grief. So I just wanted to throw it out to y'all. How would you describe grief?
I don't even know in a lot of ways, because for me, like, I think of all the grief that I've experienced and it's been so different. But I feel like the first thing that honestly came to mind was sticky. Like, I think of like, I don't know, like, it just feels sticky. Like, it's, you can't get out of it easily at first, but eventually you do. But that was like the first thing that came to my mind. I don't know if anybody listening will resonate with that, but
I can see that. The first thing I thought it was empty, like a hollowness. Like it's created a void in your life that feels like you're not going to be able to fill it or replace it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how we're all describing like a single word that came to mind, because the word that came to my mind was heavy. It's just like the weight of the world, or like your world has crumbled down around you and everything just feels so heavy.
Yeah, because I was thinking it could be a heaviness for what you've lost or what you perceived that you lost, which are two very different things, but both related to grief.
So if grief is so, I was just going to say, like, grief is so wide that I think, like, again, like, thinking back to just different times that I've experienced grief and the different variety, like, grief of for me, of losing like a loved one felt very different than maybe the grief that I experienced going no contact. Like those griefs, like I feel like giving it a name, just for, at least for me, like for all those different scenarios, looks so different.
Mm-hmm.
So KBI, I love that you brought that up, and I'm sure we'll get into like different types of grief and things like that. But like, if you all are thinking of, I mean, it could be a definition of grief, but like, what is kind of a common theme? We all named like words, but like, if somebody was like, what is grief? I know we just said, sticky, empty, heavy. How would you all like define it?
Yeah, it feels hard to define based on symptoms alone, because almost any emotion could kind of slide in there, or any experience could sort of be tied to. But I do think of like the repeated drawback to either what you've lost or the perceived, perception of what you lost. And it just is sort of cycling you back to this event again and again. But like, what you could feel and experience in the midst of is sort of like trauma, that it's like anything. Like, I know we'll talk about the stages of grief, which were never meant to be stages, by the way. But like you can experience anything in the midst of grief, which is why it's sort of hard to talk about in a way, because in like talking about trauma is like, anything is a possibility underneath the umbrella of grief, of what it looks like.
Yeah. I love that you said that. And I love that you highlighted loss, because I think a lot of people just associate grief with death. And it really is that loss. And then kind of like we've talked about how trauma is really our response. I feel like grief is our response to that loss. And grief looks so different for everyone, like you both have already highlighted. And grief can look different within a person, depending on the type of grief.
I just pulled a Jess and I looked it up.
No way.
On the dictionary.
This is a moment in time.
I know, guys. And Merriam-Webster, and I think this really hits it, is it just says it's a deep and poignant distress.
Okay.
And I just thought that was like, because again, everybody's deep and poignant can look very different, but I feel like that encapsulates it in some capacity, because that feels like there's a spectrum there.
Yeah.
So KBI, like you already said, reflecting on some of the times that you've experienced grief, I think, like I already mentioned, a lot of people think of death, but what are some other areas, like either you all have experienced, if you're comfortable with sharing, or like that you have worked with clients on with regard to grief, in addition to death, but beyond that as well?
I've done a lot. I've actually weirdly done a lot of, and it has to do with death, but pre-grieving. So when someone, I've had a lot of clients who their family members have gotten like terminal diagnoses, and kind of going through that grief process preemptively in a way. And I would say the other type is, which is something that I've had to go through, is kind of grieving the childhood I wish I had, and really processing what that looked like as an adult.
I know for me, I mean, working in a hospital, working with individuals who get diagnoses like grief of their healthy life or normalcy, teenage years. I mean, I saw a lot of grief in the pandemic, like grief of missing out on, I mean, that could have been a whole episode, like school, things like that. I know a personal thing for me that I went through, and Justin, I don't know if you can relate to this at all, because we both had kids during the pandemic. I had to grieve what I expected my first pregnancy and bringing a child into the world look like, because my husband couldn't come to any of my appointments. Like when we had our daughter, which I actually didn't mind, like he was the only one that was like allowed to be there. There was no visit, like all that kind of stuff. So how I envisioned like my first pregnancy and delivery being, and there was like other stuff in that, was very different because of the state of the world at that time. And that was something I had to work with my therapist on a lot because I didn't realize it was grief going through it. I was annoyed until I really talked about it.
Yeah. You grieve expectations. I feel like that happens a lot in life. You know, you get to that last round of an interview for a certain job and you're starting to picture it. I mean, I know a lot of people were grieving proms and they're grieving graduations and all these things through the pandemic. I've definitely grieved, like, I know we're talking about sort of the other forms of grief. And I can talk about like my dad and my brother, who I talk about all the time. But I've definitely grieved. Besides death, the times I felt it the most is opportunities. Like when I was doing the acting thing and you make it through the first few cuts and you really want to roll and you don't get it. Like that felt very similar of like, just the bargaining and the depression. And I felt that in the content creator space as well, of like had certain opportunities that like presented themselves and were close to like clicking and then didn't and drop off. And you're like, damn, like that would have been a really good opportunity to talk about mental health or just like, you know, get your content out there, whatever it may be. That's happened a lot. I feel like I've experienced that a lot in the last 3 years of opportunities that are there and then slip away or just don't come to fruition. But I experienced those lows kind of as a result of that. Again, related to expectations. But I hear a lot. People, you grieve the mother you didn't have. You grieve the childhood that got skipped over. People grieve a lot of things that they deserved and didn't get.
I mean, I just had to go through this grieving, like losing, like leaving a job. Even if it was a willing, like sometimes I think it's important to note, like even if you make a willing choice, so right, I willingly left my job, but I still grieved that process. And so, you know, I think we can look at grieving as anything that creates change in our life that we have a sadness about. Now, those processes, and that's where we come back to where the processes look different for everybody. Like me grieving my job is going to look very different than when I grieved my grandfather dying. And so, and even then, like me grieving my grandfather dying might look different than me grieving my cousin dying. And so that's what's really important about a lot of this is that it looks so different, which is why like there's no like one size fits all for a treatment or an approach or things like that. Because I mean, even just look at we go back to the pandemic, right? The grief and loss people experienced. There were probably people very excited that they didn't have to walk at graduation. Their senior year. They were like, yes, this is awesome. I don't have to be up in front of people. Like it's done. Cool, great, done. And then there are other people where that was very, very detrimental and a poignant moment in their life.
Yeah, the variability is so wide. I think because, and I've shared this before, but after my dad died, like that full year following, the only thing I felt was anger. But then with my brother's death, I feel like it was like the opposite. The only thing I felt was depression. Like nothing could give me joy or get me up the year following my brother's death. But, you know, both different chapters of my life, separated by 3 years, but felt very differently. Some of that is the relationship you have with people. Some of that is just, I guess, coping. But you can cope very differently depending on when it happens in your life. And I know people who lose people early, like in childhood, what they'll describe feeling experience can be really different than at other points. But it just goes into this more complicated thing about timing, where you are in your own life, your own stability factors, but also just what you're going to feel is what you're going to feel regardless.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to everything you all have said. And even thinking about grief in the sense of death and loss, like when I've lost people in my life, the way I've grieved looked very different. I think age is one, relationship. Also for me, like, you know, I can think of when my grandfather died when I was in high school. He died of a heart attack. So it was very unexpected. It was also shortly before my birthday. I was going to be the first grandchild without him alive. And the grief of that looked very different than when my other grandfather passed away, who had been fighting prostate cancer for, by the time he passed away, almost 20 years. And so time with him was like, you know, so, and he was on hospice and, you know, it was a loss, but like we knew it was coming. Same with my grandmother versus like my cousin who died by suicide. That came out like, so just, I think also, especially when it comes to death, at least for me, I can only speak to my experience. Age of the person and the means in which it happened isn't an older person that, you know, you can look back and be like, oh, they lived a great life. Was it like, there's so many complex factors.
Yeah. Especially within the death sense, it's when there's a lot of unknowns, like what happened, and I get pulled into that a lot with my brother, into the bargaining state, no matter how many years have gone by here. And I'm like, there's just a lot of unknown surrounding how he died, like the people he was with, and those questions like linger. But I think that's hard. Like in any sort of death, there's always things you wish you could have done, or answers you wish you could get. Or of course, the most obvious is like wanting more time. But those are the hard things. Like I know, like the final stage again, which is not supposed to be linear or really a process, is acceptance. And I've always wondered, what the fuck do you mean by acceptance? I've always felt that. I'm like, and listen, it's easy to be critical. Like someone's got to create some sort of theory. Okay. I got no fucking theories. So I'm not being critical of old Kubler-Ross. She did the best she could, and it is helpful. But when I don't think of acceptance as like, oh, I accept that, like, let's put that away now. I almost think in my mind, if I was going to rename whatever the last thing would be, I would call it the new chapter. Because I feel like accepting means that, like, it feels like you answered the questions. It feels like you're like, yeah, I can embrace what happened here. But I feel like when I see people move through grief, when they start to be invested in the new chapter of their life, because it's going to look different, that's where I feel like people have carried forward in their grief. Versus, I know a lot of us can feel this way for years, months, whatever, where it's like you're not in your current life. You're not writing the new chapter. You just are stuck, relating back to what KBI said in the beginning.
I love that you said that, Justin, because I think for me, like acceptance when it comes to like death and the loss of a loved one is much harder conceptualized versus like, you know, I'm going to use myself as an example again. Like I've accepted that my first pregnancy was not how I planned it. Like I worked through that in therapy and I can like move on. I can't change the past, you know, potentially if we ever have other kids in the future, it may be different. But when it comes to like grief surrounding the loss of a loved one, like I love how you said writing the new chapter, and there's a metaphor, you all probably have seen it. And it's basically like grief doesn't get smaller over time. Your world around it just gets larger. And I think of that kind of as acceptance. Like your whole world is not the grief anymore. Cause like I'm thinking when you brought that up, you know, my friend Claire, who suddenly died of a brain tumor shortly after diagnosis, like, have I accepted that she's gone? Cognitively, like logically, I can recognize that she's not here. But like, have I like fully emotionally accepted it? No, it hasn't even been 2 years. Like it's just, I don't know. I don't like the word acceptance either. Sorry, Kubler-Ross. We're not criticizing you, but we are.
It's hard. It's just hard to narrow in and create the terms. Because when I think of the anger, I think of the denial, I think of bargaining. Like all those make so much sense. But like, as we've talked about, literally anything you feel. And I know KBI, you've talked about going no contact with your mom a lot. It's like in making a big decision like that, in grief being involved, it's like, what couldn't you feel? Mm-hmm. It just feels like,
I mean, I like,
and I think that's what makes it I think that's what makes grief so messy is that it's all just like, you could go from one side to another really quick. And like, there were times when I was in the grief of going no contact, and I'd filter back between literally like being angry at her, being angry at myself. Then I would go to being happy, like, thank God. Then I would go to guilt, and then I would go like, and you ping pong. And I do think with time, like, I mean, I can say where I'm at now. Again, everybody is different. I don't ping pong as much, and I don't ping pong as often. So a lot of my feelings around it, like, I don't feel guilty anymore in that aspect. A lot of times my anger now, it usually goes back between anger and happiness, or content, I guess I should say. Like, I'm content with my decision. I'm happy with the decision I make. But then I'm angry because I'm 31 years old and I don't speak to my mother. And so, and being able to, again, process that. And I think one of the things we talk about acceptance is, I really just look at it as kind of like that radical acceptance from DBT, is that I'm not fighting reality. It doesn't mean I approve of it. It doesn't mean that I like it. And I agree that that term is not great. I don't know if there's even I do like what you said, Justin, is like a new chapter. But I think there's not a great term that talks about like moving forward. Yeah. Because even if you use the term moving forward, well, I'm leaving it behind. Well, that's not the case. That person, that thing, that whatever is always with you in some capacity. And that's what I think that last phase, whatever you want to call it, is really, really hard. Because I know we talked about, like, we touched upon it, of it like being phases. And I mean, we'll probably dive into that. But it's just always just such a process. And it's everything. I mean, we go through, I always joke that grief and loss can be over the death of like your parent, but it can be over the grief and loss of me ripping a hole in my favorite shirt. Like, the grief and loss looks very different for me ripping a hole, getting a hole in my favorite shirt. It looks very different. But like, we go through grief and loss daily in some capacity. It's just some things are very much less intense on our personal spectrum than other things.
And as you were talking, KBI, and you kind of hit on this, but I wanted to circle back to it. I think listening to you, one of my issues with the term of acceptance, and maybe this is the concept of the stages of grief, because Justin, as you've already said, they were never meant to be stages. Acceptance sounds like you're closing the book and like you're not grieving anymore. And I don't know about for you all, but like, especially when it comes to like grief of death, like without fail, even if I did not have a calendar, my body will remind me of dates, like around like death anniversaries, or like, a song comes on and it reminds you of a person, and then you're like back. Like, so grief, I guess in my mind too, acceptance, and maybe this is not how she meant it, but even just the concept of stages, if you complete quote unquote the stages, also we know it's not linear, so you can go accept and then feel fall back into a depression and things like that. It sounds like once you've gone through the stages, you're over it. And grief can last a lifetime, depending on what it is. And now, like KBI said, ripping a hole in your favorite shirt, that grief might not last a lifetime because, you're frustrated, you're mad, you deny that it happened, you're angry. But then, maybe the next year you buy a new shirt you like better and you're over it.
If I ever rip a hole in my Taylor Swift Eras Tour shirt, I'm done. It's done. I will never get over that.
Quoted.
But yeah, I don't know. I think the idea of the stages and
what are the stages?
Yeah, I don't know. What are the stages?
What are the stages?
Justin, do you want to take this or do you?
I believe if we're going with the 5, I'm not going to call anyone out who helped me with the poll questions, but I think they mixed up the 5 and the 7. But the 5 are denial, bargaining, anger, depression. I think maybe it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Don't quote me on that order.
Yes,
but I know
that is correct. I have it up. Okay.
Yeah.
But then KVI looks so confused. There is another conceptualization that has 7 stages.
And I think that one you might have included shock. But
I don't think I did. Maybe did I? Maybe I confused like the denial, shock. Like I see them as like
so shock and denial are in the so with the 7 stages, shock and denial is the first.
Fucked up Aaron. I'm sorry.
No, it's all in the same. But it just goes to show how these are good pillars to sort of use to discuss as general experiences you might have. But again, anything's possible. But jumping back off of what you were saying, Jess, it's interesting. At the time of this recording, tomorrow is my dad's 60th birthday. And it's like, he's been gone now for 19 years. He died when I was 19. So it's like, there's just like a lot of milestones hitting me at once. I'm like, he's been gone for as long as like, I had him for half my life. I'm 38 and he's been gone for half. He would have been 60 tomorrow. I just feel depressed. Like I feel depressed, and then my mind, I caught myself a couple days ago when I was on a run. That's always when stuff seeps into my brain. I don't know why, but I was like starting to do a bit of bargaining. I'm like, man, if he would have gotten that cancer today, there would have been better treatments for him. Like that, maybe he would have been able to still be around because cancer treatments have improved drastically since, 20 years ago. But I say that all to say of like, it doesn't end. Like you had said, like your life becomes bigger, but then, birthdays, milestones, it'll pull you back to a place where it's like, do I feel like I've regressed? No, I just feel like this is what grief is.
I think those moments are really hard because I think that's what pulls us back in. We kind of, we manage, many of the other days a year, but especially those, holidays or anniversaries or birthdays or things like that, especially when it comes to the death of a loved one. Those are those moments where we start kind of reflecting even more. And then we catch ourselves kind of doing that, which I think is natural. But it then brings up all those feelings and it's like, oh, shit.
Yeah. And as we were going through like the stages of grief, and I don't know if you all have had this experience either with people in your personal life or in therapy, and this is something I've seen a lot, is, working with children and teens, parents will be like, they just don't seem to be grieving this event, like if there's a death, because it also looks different. Like how depression can look for someone looks very different. Or like, some people initially manage by like shutting down, or maybe like continuing on with their life and like not wanting to think about it. So I think even within those stages, which, I think we can all relate to them, and how that looks can be so different. some people grieve and can't get out of bed for days, weeks, months. Another person can have the same exact experience and be like, nope, I need to get up, go to work. Like, I'm one of those people. Like, that probably doesn't surprise you all, but like, need to get up, go to work and do. Like when I was flying up to Maryland for my friend Claire's funeral, I worked half a day and they were like, why are you working? And I was like, because if I just sat at home this morning, just like waiting for my afternoon flight, that would have been miserable for me. Yeah. Where other people need to take that time off. So I think it also, like, especially if I don't want to say are judging other people, but like we can look at other people and like they don't seem to be grieving and it just looks so different for people.
Well, a lot of the people, there's a good chunk of people in my family who don't really speak to me anymore because my grandmother, who I was intensely close with, passed away several years ago. And it was right before a trip to Disney that I was taking. And her funeral was while we were in Disney. And me and my husband, we had planned this trip. This was pre-baby, pre-Oliver. It was just like a little vacation for us. And I remember sitting there and saying, I could cancel my trip and go to her funeral. I could fly home in the middle of my trip and go to the funeral, or I don't go. And I chose not to go. Even though that this woman was super important to me, I chose not to go because the first trip to Disney that I ever took was because her and my grandfather paid for it. And I chose to memorialize that, and make that my process of grieving. And I did, a symbolic piece while we were there to help me grieve in that. But my other family members didn't see it as that. And the people who I cared about their opinions, they knew and they agreed with me. They were totally fine with me not going. But a lot of my other family members talked shit because I didn't go to her funeral. And again, like we look at it and we say, like, everybody can grieve so differently. This person that was so important to me. And for me, I was like, I don't want my last memory of her to be at a funeral.
Yeah.
This super important person. And, I had to make that choice and figure out what was appropriate for me in that moment.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. It's so true. And I've been to a lot of funerals, but the one thing I always take away is like funerals are for the living.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, and it relates exactly to what you said. It's like, if going to a funeral or being at a funeral helps with your process, then by all means. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But people can have their spiritual beliefs, so I won't stomp on those. Whatever you believe, you believe. But my beliefs are much more of like, when I die, whoever's there and whoever's not there, I'm not going to be bitterly shaking my fist from the great beyond, like, you son of a bee. But I think it gets real cultural though too, right?
Oh,
like,
yeah, absolutely.
You get used, like, however you think someone should grieve or mourn someone's death is so enmeshed in the culture you come from.
Yep.
And traditionally, us white folk have a very somber, sad grief and funeral type process. It certainly isn't true in a lot of Hispanic culture and Mexican culture, and specifically is coming to mind, where it is much more of a celebration.
A celebration of life.
That's what I want.
Absolutely. But you can't, because it's tied into your culture and the way you see death. You got to zoom out from it and kind of think about, wait, how do I treat, death and dying? It's not to say like you shouldn't be sad and stuff, but in particular with what you were talking about, funerals and stuff, I'm like, it's so cultural.
Oh yeah. I always joke that when I die, I want to be cremated and put my ashes in fireworks, so you can blow me up.
Okay.
Make a pretty celebration.
Noted.
I will leave money to buy a god-awful amount of tequila and vodka for everybody to just have a big old party. Because I don't I'm not I don't think anybody is a fan of funerals. I don't think people are like, yeah, but I don't like the somber. I don't like the sad. I'm like, I don't want to sit here and cry with a bunch of people. I want to sit here and tell the funny story about Uncle Jerry getting into a fist fight with a donkey.
Okay. Yeah. Justin, when you were talking about it being like so culturally tied, a memory of going shopping with my grandmother after my grandfather died. And she was like, I need to, pick out a dress for my husband's funeral. And the lady was like, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll bring you over here to the black dresses. And she was like, I'm not wearing black to my husband's funeral. She was like, no, and in her, I mean, obviously she grieved. They were married for, 50 something years by the time he died, but and we had to celebrate. Well, he actually had a couple of funerals, a couple of celebrations of life, but she was like, no, we're going to celebrate his life. She was like, I don't wear black regularly. I'm not going to wear black, but that's even so cultural. Like, you wear black, you're like, yeah.
I know the vibe you immediately get is that whispering, everyone keep their head dipped. Like, I've been to enough funerals. Like, I know what it looks and feels like, but yeah, I'm not interested in that either. Maybe because my own trauma of going through that, within my own core family. It just, it feels like a disservice. It feels like a disservice to celebrating somebody's life and the life that they live. Because it's wild to think about. That's like the one thing we're all going to do is die. And yet we don't spend much time at all talking about planning for our inevitable death. People listening to this right now, somebody's commuting to work and they're like, yo.
Damn, this is a downer.
Like, thanks for that, dude. But it's true.
It's going to be a Monday morning. Happy Monday morning. Let's talk about death.
Yeah. But it is. And if there's anything I've experienced, and I've spent a lot of time on this, I've written out what I would like to happen when I die and all these things. But I think when you experience unexpected death from people who are very young, it's so blindsiding that you're like, yo, it's almost like I don't want that to be other people's experience around me.
Yeah.
And so my sort of trauma response in some ways is like writing everything out that I would want, how I'd want people to react, and it's not necessarily over controlling, but just so people can know I've thought about my own death. You don't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we plan everything else in life, but we sure avoid the shit out of that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Fireworks.
I like it. It makes sense to me. As soon as you said it, I'm like,
and you saying that, Justin's like, oh, like my husband and I have talked about it, but like now I'm like, oh, maybe I need to actually like plan more for it.
I mean,
That's
what I'll do after recording. Send you all a text.
And if anybody who needs to plan anything, just should plan less.
Touche.
Yo.
I know we've talked about like everything's different. It's unique to everybody. But I did want to ask you all if you have any go-to interventions or things you like to do with clients that come in for grief, or grief happens while you're working with them.
I think it is tricky for the factors we've discussed in terms of it's not something, same with trauma. It's not something you like you had alluded to, Jess, of like, they're not talking about it. Well, right now, or at any chapter in their life, it may be best for them not to.
Yeah.
It may be best for them to stay afloat in other ways. Keeping the door open as a possibility and checking in, I feel like as a therapist is important, but I totally disagree with like, you must talk about this person who died. When people are open to it, I love the letter writing. I feel like I've seen that be so helpful for people. If they're not into writing or anything like that, like there's ways we can have the discussion, but it's nice to have a conversation and write out things that have gone unsaid. I think a lot of things go unsaid in death, and having a chance to write that out and kind of have the communication is a way to sort of express things that are inside of us that, again, going forward and going unsaid feels heavy for many people.
And And I think that's for either side, right? Too, like the things that are unsaid good and the things that are unsaid bad. Like, I just saw, actually, this is ironic because I just saw a clip of, I don't know if any of you guys watch Yellowstone.
My mom loves that show.
I only watch the clips on TikTok when it comes up. And like earlier today, it was, I guess, spoiler alert, sorry guys, but the episodes have been out forever now. They find this like young kid and his dad's dying in the hospital. And Beth looks at him and says, say what you want to say. And he's like, fuck you, you piece of shit. And I was like,
fair.
Valid.
Yeah.
Love and hate that for you, but okay. But like having that space to like, whether it's a letter, whether you're talking out to the universe, but to just kind of put that out, because sometimes like that is sometimes the hardest part about grieving is the things that are left unsaid.
Yeah. What about you, Jess?
So I think, like, I always ask individuals, like, what's helpful, what's unhelpful for you, but especially working like in medical field, in the hospital and stuff. A lot of times I like to do tangible things, like especially working with kids and teens. So like on their birthday, like bake a cake that they would have loved. Or I'm thinking of one patient I had years ago whose sister died in a car accident. And one thing that she wanted to help do was plan the funeral, but she wanted to like pick balloons that were her sister's favorite color and like pick her sister's favorite foods and things like that. And that really helped her grieving process. And so like I'll offer things like, would it be helpful to like put together like a photo album of you together? And if they're like, no, I'm like, okay, looking at pictures is too hard. Or is it helpful to, if they're buried at a gravesite, going to talk? So I like to kind of find ways that people can, especially on those like hard days, find some joy or celebration in like the memory. But once again, it's very specific to the person.
You know, it's specific to the article.
I was wondering where you were going to go with that.
No transition at all.
No, there was not. I'm sorry.
I can't wait to pool one day all of these really crappy transitions.
Yo, we gotta have a top 10 worst of all time.
Group members vote on your worst transition.
That would be straight up in at least top 3.
It's up there. As soon as it left my mouth, I'm like, this is definitely top 3.
Not your best work, Justin.
Not your best.
No.
Yes. So we kind of touched on this, but didn't dive into it. Grief during the pandemic. So the question I'm going to pose to you all is very broad. Like, how do you think grief showed up during the pandemic? Either areas people experienced grief, specific types of grief.
The grief of daily living.
Okay.
Of being able to just do things normally. Like, I remember, like, I feel it was only 3 years ago, but it's like, you know, waiting in line to go into a grocery store because they're at capacity, or like needing to wait in your car at the doctor's office until they call you to come in. Like that normalcy, that loss of that.
Yeah, I was thinking of like moments in time, like again, so-and-so's first birthday, so-and-so's graduation, weddings. Like I think a lot of grief surrounding moments, celebrations.
Yeah. So this is actually a lit review of various studies of grief during the pandemic. And so first thing I want to highlight is different types of grief that were found to be studied related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So grief for self. So the loss of life events, loss of employment, loss of milestones, loss of financial security. So that's really what you all were talking about. Relational grief. So more of the traditional grief after losing a loved one, which we know then became even more complex during the pandemic because, you know, once again, this is very cultural, but then you couldn't have necessarily the traditional funeral, or maybe you didn't see them before they died, as well as collective grief. So the grief that we all experienced together going through the pandemic, even if our individual grief was different. And then there's also been a lot of research on grief among different age groups. So the research on children really looked at how grief manifests as somatic symptoms and behavioral problems, which you can imagine they're out of school, they're not in their social activities, things like that. Adolescents, grieving process looks a lot like adult, but some literature has looked at how grief during the pandemic disrupts identity formation among adolescents because, missing out on those milestones. A lot of the literature on adults has focused on how marginalized and disadvantaged communities had more complicated and prolonged grief compared to majority individuals. And we can think about there's so much literature on how just COVID itself impacted marginalized communities worse. Yeah. And then with the elderly, they experience a lot of anticipatory grief and complicated grief due to lack of support system, isolation, and things like that. So it was a really interesting lit review. So I tried to summarize as much as possible. But any thoughts that stuck out to you all?
Well, before you started talking, and then it was confirmed in that, it made me think of when you had someone like an elderly individual who was maybe in a facility or things like that. And you didn't get to hug them for a year and then they pass away. And that you're not even able to see them other than Zoom, and the impact of that compounding of both of those things, that grief coming together of what that looks like. And I even one of those things too is it made me think of the individuals who went into the hospital with things like COVID or other medical issues and died in the hospital and could not have family around. Individuals who were on life support and had to be taken off life support with no family, and the impact that has on the surviving members of not being able to be there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was reflecting on how it definitely shows how much privilege you had of how you bounced back or even navigated through. I'm thinking of marginalized people or any individual who might have lost a job and then struggled to find a job post-pandemic or just make the ends meet. And we know how that kicked into the housing crisis we're in. And I'm thinking of all those factors. It's it's easy for a lot of us to be like, oh, the pandemic's over. Or thank God we can go to the movies and see Barbie, which again is phenomenal. But that's a very privileged lens for probably the ripple effect that so many people are still suffering and struggling because of the pandemic directly.
Well, and Justin, even in something that you just said there, so many people can be like, oh, the pandemic's over. I don't know about where you all are, but in South Carolina, COVID-19 is running rampant right now. We're getting emails at the hospital all the time, masking, our hospital is full again, which we haven't. And I think that even is just a privilege in the sense that, and I'm not saying you, but people that can just go live their life, and it's no, but the people that we're seeing are those marginalized individuals, and it's still very much ongoing, and like you said, the ripple effects and the impact of that.
Totally. And now tangentially, I don't know why I can't say that word. I gave it my best try, but no, I just caught COVID again. This is at least the second time I've had it, a month and a half ago, and it took my brain. I was it took my brain offline for weeks. I just felt so exhausted, and I guess as these viruses mutate, they're less deadly because they want to keep the host alive. But that doesn't mean the symptoms aren't real problematic. I'm is my brain ever going to come back online?
Was ever online to begin with?
Listen, and it was an interesting experience because I got told by a very reliable source, now you have the slightest clue what it might feel like to have ADHD at times. And I was like, yo, because I'm I can't concentrate. My brain's all over the place. And I was like,
it's difficult, isn't it?
I was, if it is, because who knows, but if it is, I'm like, yeah, like I felt like there wasn't enough coffee in the world to get me to focus on anything.
Yeah.
Anyways.
But know what we can always focus on?
The polls.
The polls.
Oh, I love those polls. Gosh, we love some good polls.
The polls Justin didn't do?
Especially when your bestie, KBI, helps you out with the polls.
I've already done them too.
I'll try.
She did. I texted her. I was like, "Do you need help with them?" And she sent me a screenshot of the notes. And I was like, "Oh, you did it good."
They're already done. I've just been waiting for Justin to ask or not do them.
Just flying back into the country, which we'll have fun talking about come October. But thank you for helping me out, KBI, with these. I'll try not to be too critical.
Oh, I'm not very smart sometimes.
No, that's
You're very smart. Don't talk about my friend that way.
Yeah. First question, though. Grief, which is, again, a real important one. Grief is only experienced when someone you know dies. True or false?
False.
There we go.
And I think our group members knew that.
I experienced grief this morning when my coffee was done.
When it was
sad. When it was done. When it was gone.
When she drank it all.
I thought you were like brewing. I'm like, what? When you finished. I know. Sometimes those are the moments where I'm like, do I have an addiction? Why do I want more? I'm like, I'm chasing that feeling of the coffee high. 99% of you knew it was false. It's very good. This is probably a trick question, but we'll leave it at that. How many stages are there in grief and loss? So we had 7, 3, 5, and 10, which...
It was 5. It was
so
5.
That's what I figured.
I didn't realize that there were 7.
So the Kubler-Ross added 2 more later. But
sorry.
I feel like the majority said 5.
Yeah, 65% knew it was 5, but 25% said 7. So
you're not wrong either.
25. You're not technically wrong.
So 90% of people got it correct.
I had it right. That's right. Which one is the first stage of grief and loss? Bargaining, shock, anger, depression.
Shock.
Traditionally, it'd be that old shock or denial. 77%.
Ooh.
Wow.
12% have bargaining, which, again, there's no real order. It makes sense to me. You start off with why did this happen? Could I have done something? Could I have changed the outcome?
Give me one more day.
Give me one more. Yeah. Grief and loss is the true or false. Grief and loss is not a linear process and looks different for everyone. True or false?
True.
97% knew it was true. That's so important. That's so important to hold. And this one I thought was really interesting. How old were you when you first remembered experiencing grief? 12 or younger, 13 to 18, 19 to 30, or 30 plus?
I'm going to say 13 to 18. I feel like our group members, teenage years. I don't know.
63% of our group members said 12 or younger.
Oh, wow.
I was
12.
Yeah.
I put that as well, but.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have as well. That's when my grandma suddenly died and she had just turned 60. Yeah. Y'all, we always appreciate your participation in the poll. It's interesting. It's like it's a mini data collection. And a lot of times I feel surprised, but I'm always interested.
Yeah.
But there's also something else I'm always interested in.
The group member questions.
Always interested in.
Guys.
I know you all submitted so many questions.
So many questions. So many. There were 51.
We love to see it.
Woo. Hot damn.
51.
Let's do some scrolling.
So for our group members, KBI has her own little formula and thing here. So Justin and I have no idea what questions she's about.
We don't know what's good.
No idea. I wrote it down on paper. I numbered them. It was a hot mess tonight, guys. I mean, I'm a hot mess every day, but today was exceptional. Oh, so the first question is from Jess from Maine, and she just asked, I'm not sure how to form my question, but really, what do I do with grief? What do I do with all of this energy and all of this kind of pent up feeling?
Mm.
It's not fair. And she goes on to talk about like it's not fair. It's a lot to hold on to. So what do we do with that energy?
It depends. Like, I hate to say that. And I think trying to navigate for you, Jess, like what makes you feel good or what gives you an outlet for that grief, if that makes sense. So, for somebody, when they have a lot of pent up energy, they need to do something physical, like exercise or box, or some people need to cry. Some people need to paint. Some people put their grief or energy into like advocacy work, depending on what happened, like putting their time and energy. So I think for you, it would depend on what would give you an outlet that releases that grief energy. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. And I know. In some ways, like the question I might pose to someone is like, how might you honor their legacy? And again, there's infinite ways you can answer that. Like I know just throughout advocacy work, depending on how they might have passed, what might have happened to them. But even in the things they might have liked, enjoyed, the things you might have shared together, I think of that as a way of sort of allowing yourself to be in this moment, but also carrying a piece of them with you. So it's something I've thought about a lot with both my brother and my dad. And as I'm teaching my son to skateboard, I think about, especially with my brother, but my dad loved doing anything outside and sports related. But I'm like, that's something me and my brother cherish together. Both 90s kids, literally up to no good, way too many concussions. But there's something about learning something new that's hard, that instilling that in my son, that like things being challenging in life and going towards them is good for you. And like many of the best things you're ever going to do in life are going to be very hard. And it won't be the things that just fell in your lap or were handed to you. But I feel that in the way, like I honor both my dad and brother's legacy in spending time with my son. And if he ever hates it and quits, I know someone's listening, like, you make your son skateboard. If he ever hates it, trust me, get him to do something else. But I think those are the little ways that we sort of honor and, again, carry forward.
Andrea from North Carolina asked, they say that time makes it easier. Is that true? Is there supposed to be a time limit on how long grief can hurt?
No time limit. And I think I still go back to that metaphor. I mean, people might not relate to this metaphor, but it has been true in my life that, your grief doesn't get smaller. Your world just grows bigger around it. So, and what I mean by that, like you're able to do more things than you were when the grief initially happened. So one could conceptualize that, yes, time in general makes it easier, but like we've already talked about, like you can put that song on your phone and go right back into that grief, or like something, a memory can be triggered, a smell could be triggered, or something that one day didn't bother you or reminded you of a person, but it was like a happy reminder. The next time that same thing happens, you can be a puddle of tears. So I think, I don't know, time can make it easier, and that's also not linear too.
Well, and again, I think every situation is so different. So there might be things where time does make it easier. And like you still have maybe like that twinge of sadness or things like that. Like I talk about this about going no contact, is time has made it easier for me. If I compare myself from, year 1 to year 5, time absolutely has made it easier. I do have those moments where grief kind of comes up, but I've been doing it for so long, 5 years isn't a long time, that I know how to cope and manage that it's not as overwhelming anymore. And it's it doesn't stick as much anymore. And again, it's so different for each person that I always joke, you could have a larger, more long-term reaction. Like I bring this back, I make a joke of it, but like I could have a longer reaction to ripping a hole in my Taylor Swift shirt than going no contact with my mom for many reasons. That doesn't, and I think that's important to note that it's so personal. Your grief journey is so personal that everything is just going to look so different for each of those things. But no, there isn't a time limit. There's no right or wrong way.
Yeah, I think if you're invested in the here and now and you're invested in writing this new chapter, I would say, yes, time does make it easier. I just think the waves in the beginning are really big and crash real hard. But as time goes on, I know we've used probably as many metaphors as we can. If you invest in your life and the time you have left, however long that might be, I think it does get easier. But like me in it right now, like anniversaries, things are going to come up that might make you feel a type of way. But I think in general, it's sort of easier to get back into your life as time goes on.
Absolutely.
Sam from North Dakota asked, when do you think is the most difficult time during the grief process? I'm sure it depends. I just passed the 2-year mark of my aunt's passing, and the seconds hit way harder than the first. Thank you for covering such a sensitive topic. There's a lot of pain around it, and it's always nice to have people talk about it instead of handling things with kid gloves. You guys are the best.
You're the best, Sam. Yeah, again, variability rules the day. But if I was going to say something as to why the second would hit harder, many people go through the first in a numbed out state, disconnected, more of a survival mode. So I don't think it's atypical at all for the seconds or thirds to sort of hit harder, because that first year can just be like twilight, numb, dissociation, or coping in sort of extreme ways. I know for me, I threw myself into school, was in like every extracurricular activity possible, was in so many different groups and communities on campus. Like I didn't give myself a millisecond to feel shit, which is sort of why I was angry all the time, because I was overly booked and stressed and many other things. But I can understand why the seconds would feel more, for sure.
Well, and I think sometimes with the seconds, like a lot of times with the first, you have more supports.
That could be. It could
like,
be.
you know, that first Christmas, like someone's checking in with you. And sometimes like that second, it's always like when you think of someone dying, like it's not the first couple weeks you ever have to worry about. It's after. Because everybody's stopping in, they're checking in with you, doing all of that. You're dropping off the 5th casserole that day. But it's week 2, it's week 3, week 4, it's after the funeral, and that starts dying off, that coping becomes really hard. So I think after like that first year, that plays a part in it. And I think sometimes we remember the second, it's a second. It's the third. It's the fourth. And time is now going away from the last time I've spent with that person. Ariana from Boston asks, as a therapist and a human, I often struggle knowing how to deal with or help people deal with sudden loss, like sudden death, suicides, natural disasters, etc. Any tips on how to handle these scenarios?
What up, colleague? Shout out to all the therapists, mental health professionals who listen to this pod.
The ones from New England. I think sometimes like there is power in just sitting with someone.
Oh, for sure.
Like, I think sometimes we so quickly want to solve people's grief, even personally, like not even like as a therapist, but just personally. Like, I watch someone go through grief. I want to take away that pain. But sometimes just letting someone exist with you with no obligation, no motive, nothing other than I'm existing in this space with you is helpful. And I find too, like, talking about the person or talking about the situation and just letting them talk, I think that also plays a big piece too. And like not tiptoeing around it.
That's it.
I was even going to say, or letting them not talk. Like I can recall so many times where somebody will come into session and be like, so my friend died. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay. Do you want to talk about it? No, but I wanted to let you know. Okay. Well, what would you like to talk about today? And then just reiterate, like, if at any point you are ready to talk about it, let me know. Because like KBI, you already said, I think a lot of times we like go into fixing, or we want to like, you know, oh my gosh, like natural disaster, let me help jump into this grief work with regard to the loss of a person, a pet. I do a lot of work with teens that have lost their pets, and sometimes they're not ready to do it. So just holding that space can be powerful, letting them know they can bring it up when they want to, or ask like, thank you for telling me. How can I help you with that? Or is there anything that would be helpful? Yeah.
I'll just validate for Ariana that balance is just hard.
Yeah.
Like you're really trying to read the client, listen to the client, read their feedback. Because both of what KBI and just said are so valid depending on the client.
Yeah.
And in general, though, like don't overlook either, but what KBI said of just being present and being willing to talk about it and be in it. They're not getting that from other people. Like it's just so rare that they would have anyone else in their life who would really sit there. And if you want to cry, cry. If you want to be angry, angry. People love to laugh and tell good stories. But, you know, sometimes we don't feel that way. I just think that holding space for either is rare. It definitely don't downplay that at all. But it's hard. It's a tough balance.
It is. And I think sometimes it's just reading the person. Like I remember, you know, when a close friend, her grandfather died, and I called her and I knew how important this person was to her. And I knew everyone was sending condolences and talking about the sadness. And I called her up and I said, how are you? And she was like, I'm struggling. And I said, tell me something good about him. Tell me something good. Tell me your favorite memory, because I want to know about him. Because I think sometimes we go back to tiptoeing. We don't want to talk about the person because we don't want to upset you. But sometimes, again, knowing the person, sometimes that is the worst thing that you could do for a person. Again, knowing who you're talking to and things like that. Like I knew that this person cared about this person and wanted to talk about them.
Yeah,
totally.
Michaela from California said, my dad recently passed away and we never really had a good relationship. We went no contact about 4 years before he passed. I go in and out of feeling anything, but I can't tell if I'm so far removed that what I'm feeling is healthy or if I'm repressing any emotions. Any tips or thoughts?
You say you go in and out of feeling anything. Part of me would start with, well, what do you feel when you feel anything? I think it's a little different. And sometimes I hear this, people be like, I just don't feel anything at all. And I think that can be okay. Like it could be that you're sort of just coping. It could be something's going to pop up later, or maybe in talking about it and asking the questions, well, how do you feel about your dad? Like, how did it feel to not have him around? How did you think a father figure should be? You know, how's that compared to the father figure you have? I mean, there's a lot of different questions a therapist could sort of like toss at you to see, like, is something there, something not there? But in the times you feel something, I would hold that, journal that, express that. And I'm not a big, you got to squeeze the lemon when you feel nothing. Because again, there might be reasons why you're not feeling anything at that moment.
Yeah. I was actually going to say something that Justin, you brought up earlier of like letter writing or just writing in general. And see if that helps you either feel more things or gain clarity. Like, are there things that left unsaid? But then Justin, you also brought up like journaling and, kind of all those ideas of, what it feels like to go no contact, not having like all of those things. But I do wonder if journaling, writing is not your thing, even just like art and expressing it and seeing if that helps kind of in a sense. But I feel like I always say this, we always say this, whatever you're feeling is valid. And I think it's hard to, without knowing you, Michaela, and knowing exactly what you're feeling, if it's healthy or not. And even sometimes repressing emotions can be healthy because they're protective in that time.
The only thing I would like to add is remembering that you've already gone through a grief and loss process when you decided to go no contact. And so obviously these are two different scenarios, but it's similar to when maybe a family member gets a terminal diagnosis. You're going to start that grief and loss process that minute. So it's going to be the same as this, is when you went no contact, you started grieving that relationship already. So your grief and loss around his death is also going to look very different than, again, I hate you, but like what a normal grief and loss will look like, even though, again, there's no normal, because you've already begun that process. People ask me all the time, what is my going to be reaction when my mom dies? I have no idea. But I do know that I'm going through that process already. And so just reminding yourself, like, it may look different for you because you've already gone through something with this relationship.
That's a really good point.
Lanny from Germany says, how can we deal with grief related to trauma? Thinking about the person I could have been or the life I could have had and how I never got out to live my best years, youth and beginning of my 20s, all the time. I miss being scared that things won't be possible for me. I'm still stuck and haven't found my way out quite yet.
My gut reaction, because I know you put best years in quotes because I was able to find this one as KB, I was reading it. Like, why does your youth and beginning of 20s have to be your best years?
Yeah.
Like, and I know like that's a thing that we're told. And, yes, like we can grieve what we wish we had in the past and what we thought our youth and early 20s would look like. And yes, I recognize that this comes with some sort of privilege. We can also take ownership of like moving forward and how we want to create our life. Like Justin already said earlier, like creating the new chapter. So grieving the past and validate yourself in that, validate that, oh, wow, like this is not where I expected to be. That's not the life I, wanted to live. And think about where you want to be and how you can get there. And, there's no hard and fast rule that your youth and beginning of your 20s have to be your best years ever. But I know that's something we're told. We're told that all the time. Like college is the best 4 years of your life. Like, no. It can be.
I'm telling you, my 30s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've loved my 30s so far too.
Chef's kiss. I got a fully functioning prefrontal cortex. Like, I got adult money. It's solid. But again, I do get that. And that's not to invalidate that piece, because, a lot of people feel that way. But it's also important, like, you can also make any years your best years.
Yeah. Yeah, I everything that's been said, I totally agree with, because I think if you really did a poll and you asked like 1,000 people, you're like, what are your best years? I think you'd be surprised to find out what people would say. Because at least on this panel, all of us are saying our 30s. And I've had a lot of shit go down in my 30s, and it dwarfs in comparison. My 20s were hectic, unstable. Like I barely knew myself. So yeah. And I wouldn't even want to glorify the 30s for someone, because 40s could be even better. Or it could be my 50s. Shoot. Once I get that AI microchip in my brain, y'all better watch out, boy. I'm coming for y'all. I'm going to get the upgrade in this brain of mine, and my 50s are going to be...
A physician I work with, because my birthday was yesterday from the day we're recording, who's much older. He's 80. And he was like, once you hit 40, it just gets better. And I was like, okay. And he goes, 40, not so great. I was like, don't tell me that. Well, because like the rest of our team is like, well, most of us are 40 or younger. But it was funny. But he said like after 40, everything just gets better and better. And I was like, okay, I'll trust you.
Out there.
The kids.
I mean, he's still working as a physician at 80. So, you know,
hey,
loves what he does. But it's like, yeah.
Yeah, we need to do an episode on retirement and how all the pros and cons and things of that. But if you love what you're doing, you're going to keep working. There's some research out there. As soon as people retire from work, they tank health-wise soon after. But
there's a lot of grief too. Anyway,
for sure.
When my grandfather retired, he retired for about 3 weeks and then went back and worked part-time because he was like, absolutely not.
Right. Yep. If work gives you meaning, and that, I think we downplay that a lot. And again, I understand a lot of people are working and they're like, this gives me no meaning. I'm tired, which I validate, but yeah.
Nikki from Alberta, Canada is asking, do you have any tips for helping young children navigate grief? So she has a 7, a 5, and a 3-year-old, and it's been almost a year now since their baby brother died very suddenly and unexpectedly. So what are some tips you guys have to help with like littles? There's a book that I truly love. It's called Here in the Garden. It's a book for littles on grief. The Invisible String. I
was about to say The Invisible String. And I think for kids, because as someone that works with kids, it also depends on their age, because if it's grief related to death, which is the question, kids don't have a concept of the permanency of death until about 7. So like how you'll talk about grief, but I know for the kids I have worked with that have like lost a sibling, and especially when I worked with younger kids, like showing them pictures, talking about the kid. And then I don't know what your belief system is, if you do believe in like heaven or an afterlife, or, you know, I know families that are like, you know, whenever you see a butterfly, that's your, you know, sibling bringing you like things that are important to your family, but also, and KB, I already brought this up about not tiptoeing around it, like being honest with kids. Cause I think I've seen this so many times working in the hospital that parents, guardians don't want to tell the siblings that something bad has happened. Kids know. And I know your kids have already experienced this loss, and I'm so sorry for your loss, but answer their questions if they have them. They're going to ask, and they're only going to ask because they want to know. And, you know, talking about it in an age appropriate manner, celebrating the sibling's birthday or things like that, asking them what they want to do, because all of them may be different as well. But there are some great books. Invisible String was the one I was going to recommend as well.
Love it.
So one thing I think Tony from Virginia, and we've touched lightly upon it, but can grief from losing a pet affect you more than other kinds of grief? There were lots of questions around like the grief of a pet.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had people seek therapy for that sole reason.
Same.
I think, listen, I think we can go on and on about it, but I think, they become a family member. They become a friend. They become a reliable confidant. They become a part of your day, into the structure of your morning. You get home from work. Just think of all the ways the pet is included and enmeshed in your life. How would you not grieve for that pet? But again, a lot of people would be like, oh, it's just a pet. But in all the things I just named, how that pet was there for you, how it was a part of your everyday life, and then they're just gone. That's grief. That's loss. That's real and it's valid. It doesn't matter what the lifespan of the species might be. The grief is real.
We actually had this conversation. I don't know if you can see Gaston. He's chilling right here on the couch. And he's perfectly fine. Let me preface this. He's perfectly fine right now. But I literally joked with my husband and I said, one, he's never dying. And if he does die, I'm never doing this again because I can't handle that. I was like, no, because I know that that's going to tear me apart. And I was like, no, because again, like you said, Justin, I think you really hit that. There's such an integral part. And I think my dog has seen me cry more than my own therapist.
I get it.
So he's just a good boy. Yeah.
Well, and I think of the unconditional positive regard, especially with dogs. I mean, I can't, I don't think fish necessarily give us unconditional positive regard, but some might. But animals aren't going to judge you or they just, they show you all that love and care and are always so excited to see you. So yes, absolutely. You can grieve the loss of a pet more than other. What?
Have you met a cat?
I know a cat's
so judgmental. They're dicks.
Okay, so I have never owned a cat because I'm severely allergic and break out in hives.
No.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
but I do get I could literally it's funny. I have a sandwich that's in my trash can, and Gaston tried to eat it, and I'm like, "Get away!" He's just looking at me and I'm yelling at him, "Get your nose out of the trash can!" He's like, "I just love you."
The way I always put it or think about it with cats and dogs, I'm like, dogs are young souls. They're so pure. They're so innocent. Cats, and I'm a cat and dog person. I've had both, and I'm definitely a both person. But cats are old souls. They're not going to bullshit you. They'll give it to you straight. They're kind of chaotic in some ways, but they'll judge the shit out of you because you needed that judgment that day.
Yeah.
Cats won't bullshit you like dogs might. Dogs definitely will give you that unconditional positive regard. But this is time for another day, but big difference between I think boy cats and girl cats has been my experience. Girl cats are a lot more exciting and active, and boy cats be lazy as fuck. But that's just my experience with them.
Okay.
All right. Last question from Rebecca from Singapore. When does grief become complicated grief? When should one consider seeking help for their grief? And I think that goes along with, there was a question here from Darren from also Alberta, Canada, on that. What are your thoughts on the prolonged grief disorder that came out in the new DSM-TR?
I mean, we'll always find part of me. The easiest thing to answer is any time is a good time to go to therapy for grief. If you're feeling it, if you're asking the question, the time's probably now. But if you're not feeling it and someone just passed, that's okay too. Again, I don't think people should be forced into therapy ever, but especially not just because someone died, shove you in front of a therapist. It might not be the right time to start talking about those things. It might be cool to get a therapist on your side to talk or not talk about it. I validate that. But yeah, I know some of these, especially with grief, I think it says if it's more than a year and you're really struggling. Is that what the timeline is?
It's a year for adults, 6 months for kids.
I mean, I shrug my shoulders at this stuff. I really do.
Yeah.
Like it is what it is. I know we try to put things in bottles and timelines, but like, listen, if you're struggling at 6 months, it's just as valid as if you're struggling at 13 months. There's no difference here.
Yeah. And like, I don't know. I worry that we're pathologizing a natural process.
Yeah.
That, as we've highlighted, looks different for everyone. Going to the second question, because, you know, I've pulled up like specific symptoms like identity disruption, such as feeling though part of oneself has died. Like, you can absolutely feel like, I'm even imagining like death of a child, like literally a part of you has, like you created that life. Disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders at the like a lot of these things, and a timeline doesn't, I don't know. I find it really hard. I understand why we have to do it. Just like major depressive disorder is like 2 weeks, and like we have to quantify it. I just worry that we are pathologizing. Now, I will say, going back to the first question, when should you seek treatment? If it is available for you whenever you want.
Right.
Like, like you don't have to be struggling for 6 months or a year before seeking treatment. I mean, you know, KBI brought up at the beginning that, you know, anticipatory grief. So if a loved one has a terminal illness, you know, getting therapy before the actual death of the individual. Yeah, I mean, and I'll be honest, like, as for like complicated grief and things like that, I'm sure there's like a textbook definition, but I feel like that's so individual as well. Yeah. Like circumstances. Yeah.
I just look at it as it's all created just so we can get insurance to pay us.
I mean, you're not lying. You're not lying. But why couldn't grief be enough? Like, that's what, like, these terms are just like, and I validate that if someone's getting swept up into the grief, you know, 2-3 years later, I get that it's sort of different than someone who maybe isn't. But to me, nothing surprising with grief, sort of like nothing surprising with trauma. It's just your experience. But I hear you. Yeah, a lot of it does come down to insurance, which if you're not in the field might surprise you. If you're in the field, you know.
Yeah. So apparently complicated grief is also beyond 12 months. I just looked it up. That's when it becomes complicated. It's like,
whatever.
Yeah.
Just.
Fuck you.
Yeah.
It's grief. It's all grief.
Yeah.
It just, because it makes you laugh in a cynical way of like, if it's at 11 months though, sorry.
It's like, yeah.
Not fuck you and your uncomplicated grief.
Yeah, can you imagine? God. It's just wild. I realize why everyone's looking at me. Well, you know what's not wild? Me doing the outro and forgetting I'm doing the outro, but I'm being a little vulnerable and honest. Yeah, this is a heavy one, talking about grief, and we get into different topics here on the pod that affect us all differently, and I know we'll share and process. We do that in the episode. We do it in our group chat outside the episode, but I love having these conversations. Anything that we bring to the light, it gives us a path forward to do something different and to not be alone in it. And that's definitely how I feel about grief. I felt that since my brother died, since my dad died. And it's one of those things where, again, whatever you're feeling and experiencing, I hope you listening to this episode, you accept is valid. And we're going to ask you, because it's inevitable. Someone in your life is going to lose someone. What's one way you can come alongside someone who is going through grief or just lost someone? What can that look like? I hope you can think of a lot of different ideas. based on the conversations we had in this episode. But we always enjoy your participation, the amount of questions we get. Again, y'all really make this podcast, and we're grateful for you to be here.
Bye.
All right, y'all. We'll see y'all next time. All right.
Bye.
Peace.